Hello friends, welcome to the fourth episode dedicated to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In this episode, we will not speak about Ukraine itself, but we'll try to discuss Russia. We'll try to find an answer. Are all Russians guilty or responsible for the war in Ukraine? Or is it just Putin? It's a difficult question, and I'm sure many of you might have different opinions. Let's try to be objective. To start with, let's establish the framework and definitions. It's not easy to define who Russians are. As I previously mentioned, Russia is an empire. There is no Russian nation state. Seriously. Russian Federation controls many nations of different ethnicities, religions, and linguistic groups. The only objective criterion that I can think of is the political allegiance. If you serve the empire and its needs, you can be defined as Russian. By serving, I mean to make a living because of and pay taxes to the Russian state and to be okay with this state as such as it exists now. I truly believe that is the only objective definition because it includes Russian oligarchs and their children who live in London and, leaders from the Russian Empire from the past. So, for example, Catherine the Great, originally born as Sophia Augusta Frederica, was a German princess who married the future Emperor Peter III of Russia. So she was German, but she's considered to be one of the greatest Russian rulers of all times. Another great leader of Russia is Joseph Stalin, whose birth name was Joseph Vissarionis Jugashvili. He was born in Gori, Georgia, which was the part of the Russian Empire back then. Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union, which was just the continuation of the Russian Empire in mid-1920s until his death in 1953. He was Georgian, and yet he served the Russian imperial needs. So both Catherine the Great and Joseph Stalin are Russian under this definition, whereas people such as Kasparov can be excluded from this definition because he holds a Croatian passport and lives in the US. Moreover, he speaks about the need to dismantle the Russian Empire, so he has no allegiance to the Russian Empire. So this is the definition. Now let's speak about the scope. So there is no point in talking about the extremists and people on the fringes because it's very easy to dismiss someone like Dugin, who is a genocidal fascist calling for the extermination of all Ukrainians, as an outlier. It's easy to say he's not representing Russians. So, to remove any doubt, let's discuss la crème de la crème of the Russian cultural icons. Let's discuss Shakespeare, Orwell, and Mark Twain of the Russian literature. The first person I want to speak about is called Russia's J.K. Rowling and Putin's nemesis. Sounds promising. Boris Akunin is the pen name of Grigory Shavlovich Chkharchishvili. It's a Russian writer of Georgian and Jewish descent. He is best known for his historical detective novels, particularly the Erast van Dorin series. This is a series set in the late 19th and early 20th century and features the fictional detective Erast van Dorin solving various mysteries and crimes. First of all, he is neither ethnic Russian nor he lives in Russia. He self-identifies as Russian and shamefully for him, he took a Russian-sounding pen name to appeal to a highly racist Russian public, to sell more books, to pretend that he is one of them. Can we call him Russian under my definition? Yes, definitely. He is a product of the Russian imperial past and makes a living thanks to it. Let's see what's up with this Putin's nemesis, so-called. His first novel introduces Fandorin as a young and naive officer in the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department. The second book is about the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, which was a war caused by resentment and revanchist feelings following the First Crimean War 20 years earlier, which Russia started and lost. He conveniently avoids the uncomfortable pages of Russian history and focuses on pages of imperial glory. Several books later, Fandorin reaches the peak of his career, achieving the rank of state chancellor. For some critics, Fandorin resembles the somewhat mythologized figure of Putin in his early days as the KGB spy. Then the Second Chechen War, then the rise to power. You see the parallels? The author denies this allegation, but for me, it's quite clear that the success of both Putin and Fandorin is due to the cravings among the Russian people for someone like Putin or Fandorin who would come and solve the Russian problems. In addition, Akunin, like the rest of Russians, is not interested in the present or the future. All he is interested in is the past. He glorifies the Russian imperial and feeds off the imperial feelings and supports the false imperial narratives about its golden age. Moreover, Akunin spoke publicly against a Ukrainian law which would make his books a little bit less profitable in Ukraine. So the essence of a new law in Ukraine was that authors like Akunin, who published books by large numbers in Russia and then simply dumped them in other Russian-speaking countries, by doing so they essentially destroyed the local publishing, now had to translate and print their books in Ukraine to be able to sell them in Ukraine. Obviously, he didn't like that because he was losing a part of his profit. So you can be anti-Putin, but you are against the desire of the formerly subjugated nations for self-determination simply because you want to make money. Next, I want to speak about Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Russian novelist, historian, and dissident who played a significant role in exposing the horrors of the Soviet Gulag system and the repressive nature of the Soviet regime. Born in December 11, 1918, Solzhenitsyn grew up during the tumultuous period of Russian history, marked by the Bolshevik Revolution, World War II, and the cruelty of the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970, but due to the political pressure, he declined to travel to Stockholm to receive the prize in person. One of the Solzhenitsyn's most famous works is The Gulag Archipelago, published in 1973. It's a 3-volume non-fiction narrative that provides a comprehensive and damning account of the Soviet forced labor camp system. The work was written in secret and smuggled out of the Soviet Union, leading to Solzhenitsyn's expulsion from the country in 1974. Solzhenitsyn lived in exile in the West, primarily in the United States, for over 2 decades. During this time, he continued to write and speak out against the Soviet regime. His works included novels, essays, and historical analysis. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Solzhenitsyn returns to Russia. He continues to be a prominent figure in Russian intellectual and cultural circles, advocating for moral and spiritual revival in post-Soviet Russia. Solzhenitsyn's works had a profound impact on the understanding of Soviet history and the consequences of totalitarianism. His courageous stance against the Soviet regime and his dedication to truth and human dignity left an enduring legacy in both literature and political thought. Sounds great, right? It's a profile that would probably stand up against Putin, but the truth is a bit more difficult. While Alexander Solzhenitsyn is often celebrated for critique of the Soviet regime, it's essential to acknowledge that he held certain nationalist views that have been controversial. Solzhenitsyn was known for his strong emphasis on Russian nationalism, but he also expressed anti-Ukrainian opinions. He believed that the process of granting Ukrainian independence was hasty and could lead to the fragmentation of the Russian world. I'd even argue that he helped inspire in Putin a destructive skepticism about Ukraine's status as a nation. In an interview with the New Yorker's David Remnick in 1994, Solzhenitsyn said that it was Lenin who created modern-day Ukraine. It's a view Putin echoed in his speech just before he launched his invasion. For Solzhenitsyn, Ukraine doesn't correspond to ethnicity or culture or language. In his eyes, it's an ugly mess. Listen to his quote.
I greatly respect the Ukrainian people. I have great sympathy for them. I myself am part Ukrainian.
Solzhenitsyn said this in the interview.
If you want to be separate, by all means go ahead, please. But within the borders of the true Ukraine. The historical Ukraine, the place where Ukrainians really live.
Solzhenitsyn was drawing a distinction between the west of Ukraine and the east of Ukraine. For him, the western Ukraine is the real Ukraine. Meanwhile, he believed that the east and the Crimean Peninsula has such a large Russian-speaking population that it should never have been separated from Russia in the first place. Another Nobel Prize laureate on my list is Joseph Brodsky. He was a Russian poet and essayist of Jewish descent. Born on May 24, 1940 in St. Petersburg, Brodsky began writing poetry at a very young age, and his work gained attention in the Soviet literature scenes. However, his poems deviated from the prescribed Soviet style, and he faced official criticism. In 1963, Brodsky was charged with social parasitism. You probably need to know that it was mandatory to hold a normal job in Russia. He refused to hold a regular job, and he dedicated all his time to writing poetry, which was crime under the Soviet law. So he was convicted to spend time in a Soviet mental institution, and in 1972 he was forcibly exiled from the country. Brodsky settled in the United States, where he continued to write poetry and essays. In 1987, Brodsky was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his outstanding literary work. Brodsky's poetry is characterized by its intellectual depth, philosophical reflections, and linguistic precision. In addition to his poetry, Brodsky wrote prose, often addressing themes of exile, freedom, and the role of the poet in society. In essence, Brodsky's writing emphasized the importance of individualism, intellectual freedom, and the autonomy of the artist. He refused to conform, and he was critical of the oppressive nature of the Soviet regime. Again, sounds like someone we should admire. So what can go wrong with him? Brodsky expressed a strong attachment to the Russian cultural and linguistic identity throughout his life. His nationalism was mainly cultural and linguistic, but in 1990s he wrote a poem called On Ukrainian Independence. Please listen to it.
God bless you, merry Cossacks, hetmans, and Gulag guards. But mark, when it's your turn to be dragged to graveyards, you'll whisper and wheeze, your deathbed mattress pushing. Not Shevchenko's bullshit, but poetry lines from Pushkin.
It's very difficult to translate poems, so let me rephrase.
When you are dying and scratching your deathbed, you'll be wheezing Alexander's lines and not the terrace's bullshit.
So, in essence, he says, you subhumans try to live without your masters and you will fail, but it will be too late. And right before dying, you would see you were wrong. So in this poem, he mentions Alexander Pushkin and Taras Shevchenko. Who were those people? If you don't know, Taras Shevchenko is the most influential Ukrainian poet, whereas Pushkin is his Russian counterpart. Let's talk about Pushkin for a bit. He is considered by many to be the greatest Russian poet and the founder of modern Russian literature. It's difficult to overstate how important Pushkin is. In fact, all the countries that Russia occupied all the way to Berlin, they would put Pushkin's monuments and they would call streets after Pushkin everywhere. It's so funny when you take the map of Germany and try to mark where Pushkin's streets are, and you could clearly see the border between former East Germany and West Germany. So Pushkin is as Russian as it gets. I already mentioned him in our conversation with Professor Sapolsky. I want to elaborate a little bit more on one of Pushkin's poems written in 1831 after the Polish uprising. In this poem, Pushkin explains that from the Russian point of view, the uprising is just a part of the ages-old quarrel between relatives. He tells the French to leave Slavs alone because the eventual outcome of all quarrels between Slavs must be decided by the Slavs themselves. You know, it's very convenient because clearly the Russian imperial army was so much stronger than the Polish uprising. If you say, let us alone, it's basically, letting Poles die. He says that the French parliamentarians don't understand Slavs or Slavic languages. They seek a fight simply because they hate Russia. Now the Russians speak about Russophobia. 200 years ago, it was exactly the same. And why do the French hate the Russians? According to Pushkin, it's because of Russians defeating Napoleon. By the way, if you don't know, the Second World War is called the Great Patriotic War in Russia. And the war against Napoleon is called the Patriotic War. So there is an extremely strong parallel. So the Russians try to depict as they are innocent, they are being invaded all the time by Napoleon and Hitler, and they never attack anyone, they are always the victims. He continues by daring the French to attack Russia, not just with words, but he calls on the French for a military attack against Russia because the whole Russia will rise against the invaders. Now, listen to the poem.
What do you raise an outcry over, national bards? Why do you threaten Russia with anathema? What stirred you up the throes of Lithuania? Desist. This is a strife of Slavs among themselves. An old domestic strife, already weighed by fate. An issue not to be resolved by you. This is a family feud. Mute to you are the Kremlin and Praga. Is the Russian Tsar's word powerless by now? Or is it new to us to be at odds with Europe? Or has the Russian grown unused to victories? Are there too few of us? From the shaken Kremlin to stagnant China's walls, won't rise the Russian land? Send then to us, O bards, your infuriated sons. There's room for them in Russia's fields, amidst graves that are not strange to them.
So this poem is now used by the official Russian propaganda to draw the parallels between the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those narratives are extremely convenient because you can reuse them again and again. And so, what about the ordinary Russians? What about the regular people? What do they think? What do they do? Well, I think the most common position is just to wait. But this is not a passive position. They decided to wait. It's an active waiting. So they are not the victims they actively decided to wait and do nothing. Just listen to this interview of ordinary Russian people. You can find hundreds of interviews like this on the internet. This is just one random example.
Well, in general, I have a bad attitude towards the war, but since we were forced to do so, I support our president's correct actions.
I don't know. I don't get involved in politics. We are Russians. We will endure everything.
It's okay. It's tolerable so far.
We had already been used to everything, absolutely everything, and this time we got used to its situation too, and everything will be fine, I think. We tolerate it, so we don't want to give up. We don't want to be enslaved.
How much longer do you have to be patient?
As long as you have to. We are a patient people. We will endure as much as we have to.
They don't want to do anything. They are happy with the status quo, and they will just wait through difficult times and don't want to contradict the government. And this is precisely what Fyodor Dostoevsky, another great Russian author, preached: obedience and patience. You are little people. You cannot do anything. You are not subjects of your own life. The state, the God, the nature, it's all the same. It's simply a higher power. People cannot change anything in the world. They have to observe and obey. And the last bit I wanted to talk about is about sports. I'm deeply disappointed by the admission of the Russian athletes to the 2024 Paris Olympics. And here I just want to recommend to you to watch the 2017 documentary called Icarus, Icarus. It's a documentary film that explores the issue of doping in Russian sports. The film was directed by Brian Fogel, and it originally started as an experiment where Fogel, who was an amateur cyclist, he tried to investigate the effects of performance-enhancing drugs on his own body. However, the story takes a very unexpected turn when he meets Dr. Grigory Rodchenkov, the head of the Russian anti-doping laboratory. Dr. Rodchenkov becomes a key figure in the film as he reveals the extent of the state-sponsored doping in Russian sports, particularly during the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics. The documentary delves into the details of the Russian doping scandal, exposing a system of cheating and cover-ups orchestrated by the Russian government. The Russian culture is not what you think it is. The music that I used for this podcast was actually written by a British composer for an American computer game, Red Alert, and it has nothing to do with Russia. It's only based on some Russian stereotypes that people have. So, as this music has nothing to do with Russia, so is a lot of your knowledge about Russia is based on unrealistic stereotypes or legends or myths. Russia is an imperial state that exploits any possibility to influence you and tries to whitewash its evil intention. In conclusion, the Russian culture and sports are not merely an extension of the Russian imperial state. They're an integral part of it. They feed off each other and cannot exist without one another. So, are all Russians responsible for the war in Ukraine? The answer is yes, clearly under my definition of Russians as those who are benefiting in any way whatsoever or who have any sympathy for the current imperial structure of Russia, even if they have liberal views, even if they don't like Putin, even if Putin puts them in prison, all of them, they are still responsible for the war in Ukraine. They made their names, they made a living out of stealing resources from the subjugated nations or sending the subjects of the empire to die for the interest of the empire. And unless they publicly admit the need to dismantle this monstrous creature, Russian Federation, they are complicit in the crimes of the Russian army in Ukraine. Boycotting Russian events in any form is the only way. Tit for tat is a highly effective strategy in game theory. When your dog pees on the carpet, you punish it. Otherwise, it will start peeing all over the place. Red Alert might be a fun game to play, but the real war is no fun. Right now, as we speak, the Ukrainian defenders are fighting for freedom in Europe at the front line. They are the ones who are teaching the dog not to piss on the carpet and not to spread its piss all over the Europe. Please support them. This week, we are celebrating 1 year since we started this podcast in November 2022. To commemorate this anniversary, I would like to ask you to donate a specific amount of 12 euros or dollars to one of the charities listed in the description to this podcast. Those are trustworthy charities. I am not affiliated in any way to them, but I can give you my word that your money will be used in a very efficient way. So for a price of 2 Starbucks coffees, you can make a difference for someone fighting on the front line right now. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support to the Ukrainian cause. And I hope you'll stay with us. And I hope your focus will remain on Ukraine despite a difficult international environment in other places. Thank you and talk to you later. Bye.